All right. Hello and welcome back to the 101 Fantasy Football Show on YouTube. My name is Sawyer and I am your host as always. And I'm really excited because we are almost done the divisional series and the season is almost here. As of recording this, it is Sunday, the 6th of September, and the season starts on Thursday, the 10th. And so I couldn't be more excited at this point. If I needed anything, it was a bit of football in my life, and so I'm very very excited as we continue to get closer. I kind of can't believe that it's here. For a while, I thought it just wasn't going to happen, and now it's almost here, and it seems almost inevitable that at least we're going to get some weeks. Fingers crossed, we're going to get a full season. I'll knock on wood here, and we'll see what happens. But I'm pumped. I hope you are pumped as well. Today, we are going to be talking about the NFC South. So, one of the most fun divisions in fantasy football all around. You've got the Atlanta Falcons, a lot of good pieces there. The Carolina Panthers, obviously, they have this guy named Christian McCaffrey, who's pretty decent at fantasy football and real football as well. The New Orleans Saints, obviously, a lot of pieces there. And finally, we will be wrapping it up with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, the new look Tampa Bay Buccaneers with Tom Brady at the helm. Before we jump into the video today, I just wanted to say if you like my stuff or if you want to check out more of my research or some of the other things I find while doing research, you can find me on Twitter. My Twitter handle is at Sawyer_FF. As well, you can also follow the show at the 101FFS, and you will see when new videos are posted on your Twitter timeline. So, yeah, without further ado, let's get into the video because we got lots of fun things to talk about today. So let's do it. First off here, obviously you're seeing my projections. We'll come back to these at the end. But let's start with the Atlanta Falcons. What to expect from the 2020 Atlanta Falcons is probably another pass-happy offense that produces some good fantasy scorers, as they've been doing over the past 2 seasons. Last year, this offense was the number one in pass attempts and it wasn't close. They had 384 passing attempts, and I believe the next team had, 684 passing attempts, and the next team had 630 something, and so almost a 50 target gap or attempt gap between the Falcons and the next best team in the NFL, and so even if they don't repeat that, which I don't expect them to do. They were top 5 in passing attempts in 2018 as well. I expect them to continue to be a top 5 passing offense in terms of attempts. And part of that then is why I'm in on Matt Ryan as a solid option, as a later round quarterback one for fantasy football. You look at what he's done in the past 4 years. In 2 of the past 4 seasons, Matt Ryan has been a top 2 fantasy quarterback. And the one season that he was the quarterback 15 was 2017. And in that year, the team just didn't pass the ball as much. But they did switch it up with a new offensive coordinator after that. Dirk Cutter coming in. And I think that's part of the reason why the passing attempts went back up in these past 2 seasons. And this past season, the only reason he wasn't listed as a quarterback one is because he was injured. If you look at his fantasy points per game, he was actually 10th in fantasy points per game played last season as well. And so I think what you're going to get from Matt Ryan, he still has good weapons. He's got Julio Jones, Calvin Ridley. They bring in Todd Gurley. They bring in Hayden Hurst. So he still has great weapons. I think you're going to get another solid, not elite, but solid season from Matt Ryan this year. He is my quarterback 11 for redraft. He is the quarterback 10 according to ADP. So roughly around similar prices there. I think he's worth the price that you're having to pay for him in redraft right now, and I think you can expect solid production week in, week out from Matt Ryan. Now let's move on to the running backs because there's someone interesting to talk about in the Atlanta backfield, and it is Todd Gurley. If you have followed his ADP or just kind of the hype on him this offseason, it's been a bit interesting. When he first signed, he started to get hyped up. Then the news came out that the team didn't even know if he was healthy, and then he started to fall back down. And then people now have kind of split up. From that point, some people now have started to trend back up and believe that Todd Gurley is going to have the opportunity, and he still has the talent to be really, really good and be a good fantasy option for 2020. And there's people that believe the other side, which is that his arthritic knee will just catch up to him. He's not the same player he was. when he was the RB1 in fantasy football, and he will never get to that again. And so really there's two sides to this argument, and you kind of got to figure out where you feel comfortable landing with Todd Gurley. And for me, this is what I see. Last season, Devonta Freeman, who has traditionally been an injury-prone running back, who's a bit undersized, but he can run and he can catch out of the backfield, he saw 70 targets and had 184 carries across 14 games in the Atlanta Falcons offense. Behind him were guys like Brian Hill, Ito Smith, and Quadri Allison. Now, this season, Todd Gurley steps in, replacing Devonta Freeman, and they keep the exact same core of running backs behind him with Brian Hill, Ito Smith, and Quadri Allison. And so I think it's kind of like we lose Freeman, we replace him with Gurley, who we believe is a better talent when healthy. And if you stat out Freeman, his 184 carries across 16 games, that would have been over 200 carries. I believe Todd Gurley will also see over 200 carries this year. I've got him for 215 there. And I think Freeman saw those 70 targets across 40 games. Obviously, he had some rapport with Matt Ryan already, and it might take a little bit of time for Gurley to get up to speed with Matt Ryan. But I'm sure once they get clicking, Matt Ryan will understand how good Todd Gurley is in the receiving game as well. And Todd Gurley himself will see another high target total. I have him over 70 as well, just like what Freeman had last season. And when you put all that together, Todd Gurley is a talented running back. I don't think he's as good as he was before the arthritic knee, really, that issue came up. However, I do think he's still very talented. I think he's very capable of producing fantasy points. And so for me, statting him out, I feel very comfortable with this stat and the way that, or how this shakes out. He becomes my RB15, as well as he is the ADP RB15 right now. So I'm just comfortable with his price. I think where he's going is pretty fair. When you look at the running back rankings, I see 14 guys who can give you running back one numbers. And so that kind of gets cut off around Nick Chubb and Austin Eckler for me. I believe those are the two I have at 13 and 14. But then right after that, Todd Gurley is the next guy. I have him ahead of now, slightly ahead of Chris Carson and Melvin Gordon. And then even more so than below that would be like David Johnson. James Conner would be in there. And guys of that nature. And so that's where I feel Todd Gurley fits. And that's where I'd be targeting in your drafts. Behind him, by the way, you don't need to probably handcuff him this season. If he goes down, he's probably your RB2 if you have him on your team. And if he goes down, we really don't know if it's going to be Brian Hill or Ito Smith or even Quadri Olison. And so what I would say is just don't waste your pick on it. If he goes down, you're probably going to want to start your RB3 over any of those guys anyway, because they're going to be splitting work. So I wouldn't worry about trying to handcuff him despite the fact that he is injury prone. Just make sure you get a solid running back 3 option who you would feel comfortable playing in the worst case scenario. Now let's talk about the passing weapons in this offense. So we've got Julio Jones, Calvin Ridley, Russell Gage, and Hayden Hurst. Obviously, something that we need to bring up again is that there were 684 targets to go around last year. That number is going to come down. However, I still believe it's going to be a healthy number, 600 plus for sure. And I've got it around 640 targets to go around. And so you look at what that means. Julio Jones, he has been a top 7 PPR wide receiver for the past 6 seasons. That's mind-boggling. That's not points per game. That's just straight up finishes in those spots 6 years in a row. And I think people, if I asked you, do you think Julio Jones is injury prone? A lot of people would think, yeah, he tends to always be battling injury. But the thing is, he plays through those injuries and he still produces fantasy points. And so if you're looking for a guy who in your second round, if you want to go receiver there and you don't want to bust, I feel very comfortable drafting Julio Jones in that spot. He is my wide receiver 3 for fantasy football this season. He's just an uber talented guy who I don't see slowing down anytime soon. He's Matt Ryan's favorite target. He's ADP wide receiver 4, but if you can get him as your as the wide receiver 3 off the board, that's where I see him, just after Michael Thomas and Devontae Adams. Very, very comfortable with him for fantasy football in 2020 and even Dynasty right now. I think he's a bit of a value buy right now in Dynasty. He's a top 10 Dynasty wide receiver for me. I believe he is number 10 for me, but he's 31, and I think you're going to get him at a discount right now because people are scared of the drop-off. But he's a special type of talent who I think the way that Larry Fitzgerald was able to extend his career by moving to the slot when it was required of him, and he still produced positive fantasy football seasons, I think Julio Jones is going to give you at least 3 more very strong years, including this year where I think he's going to be a top 5 fantasy football wide receiver. So there you go. Ridley, well, when we want to talk about Ridley and we want to talk about Hurst, I just want to bring this up as well. Mohamed Sanu and Austin Hooper leaving, that vacated, I mean, those two combined, they were having 13 plus targets per game when they were playing. And so that's a lot of targets per game to go around now. Calvin Ridley steps up into the number 2 receiver role with Mohamed Sanu out. He already was kind of the wide receiver 2 in this offense while Sanu was there, but they cannibalized each other's production a bit. When you look at what happened when Sanu was out last year, Sanu left in week 7. Week 8 to week 14, Calvin Ridley was the wide receiver 11 in fantasy football, already proving he can be a wide receiver 1 for fantasy. This year, I mean, he shows he's got elite routes. He's great on tape. His production last year was the exact same as his rookie season, except he did it in 3 fewer games. And so you stat that out. That is much improvement from the year prior. And this year, I just think it's the 3rd year. He's going to take another step forward. All reports out of camp are really excited about Calvin Ridley for the year. And to me, he's the wide receiver 14 on my board. Doesn't quite make it to the wide receiver 1 territory, but I'm very, very comfortable and very excited to have him as my wide receiver 2 on my team, especially with his ADP of wide receiver 17 off the boards right now. This is a guy you can potentially get in the 4th round, which I think is a steal because at that point you can already have your 2 running backs locked in. You could get another receiver in the 3rd round, and you can be getting Calvin Ridley as your 2nd receiver and 4th player in the 4th round, which I am a huge fan of that. When you look at Russell Gage and what he did last year, all of his production pretty much came once Sanu was gone, and then Ridley even had the abdomen injury. And so this year, I don't think Gage is a guy you need to pick up in 2020 redraft leagues. However, someone to watch if something were to happen to Ridley or Jones, he will probably have some value just simply off of targets alone. At the tight end position, Hayden Hurst is one of my favorite tight end targets for 2020 fantasy football. You look at Austin Hooper, back-to-back seasons as the tight end 6. I know he got a lot of love last year because he did it in not playing a full 16, which is awesome. However, Austin Hooper isn't even a super special talent, in my opinion. I know he got paid, and I know the Browns might see him as a stupendous talent, but I don't think he's overly special, and I think Hayden Hurst can bring a very similar skill set now that he steps into the role. And so I'm a big fan of Hurst. Currently, he's going off the board as the tight end 13. I think that's a huge value. He's my tight end 7, and I'm buying all the shares of him because simply I think the volume will be there. I think he has a lot of talent, and he just didn't get to show it because, well, he was behind Mark Andrews, and Mark Andrews is obviously very, very good, which we've seen. You look at last year, he was already the tight end 3 as a 23-year-old, Mark Andrews was. So, I mean, that's the guy who was behind. Now he gets to be the guy in an offense that's produced with tight ends before. It was Hooper. Before that, even Tammy had some good years. And before that, obviously, some big names, big tight ends who were there before that. So I'm a fan of Hurst. When we look at the dynasty aspect, only a few things to note. Matt Ryan, Julio, Ridley, and Hurst all have 2 or more years on their contract, plus options to extend those longer. So that's going to be the core for the foreseeable future. I don't think we can plan anyone else to be a part of that for now. And then the only other thing to talk about is the running back position because Gurley only has a 1-year contract, and this team is going to pass to the running backs. They're going to give carries to the running backs, and this next coming offseason, there's going to be a lot of options in the offseason to pick up a starting running back. Lots of guys who are going to be going to free agency. Could be Todd Gurley. If he has a great season, he resigns. There you go. Now maybe we're talking about Todd Gurley as a potential RB1. But if he doesn't have a great season, I don't think they resign him. And I think they bring someone else in who we could be talking about as an RB1. So this is a situation to monitor. If a rookie RB lands here, it's a great situation for them. If they sign someone, it's a great situation for them. So keep that in mind when we're looking at Dynasty Fantasy Football. Now on to the Carolina Panthers. Carolina Panthers are an interesting team this year because I don't think they're going to be a great NFL team this season, but they have Matt Rule coming in as the new head coach from Baylor, and they have Joe Brady coming in as the offensive coordinator, which makes them interesting for fantasy because Joe Brady, if you don't know, he was the passing game coordinator for LSU last year, that offense that, set all those records and was the most dominant college football team in the nation last year. He was the passing game coordinator for that passing game that led to Joe Burrow being the #1 pick in the draft, and the passing game that picked apart the top defenses in college all year long. So interesting there. And before that, where did Joe Brady come from? Well, in 2018, he was the offensive assistant on the New Orleans Saints. And so I think, he will bring an offense that I think can produce options, because I think they're going to find ways to utilize their players to be successful. And he also handpicked Teddy Bridgewater, who he would have worked with in 2018 in New Orleans. And so, yes, I don't think Teddy Bridgewater is going to be a fantasy darling by any means, and I don't think you need to draft him in fantasy football. However, what I do think Teddy Bridgewater brings is I think he's going to allow for other players to be successful on the team, because he's going to be able to run Joe Brady's system the way he wants it to be run. And so Teddy Bridgewater, you can leave him on the wire for now. There's a chance he's actually good enough to play in a pinch, spot start him in a nice fantasy week, but I'd leave him on the wire. But who I wouldn't leave on the wire is a lot of these options here. So Christian McCaffrey, first off, there's not much to talk about with McCaffrey. He was a beast last year. Everyone knows, I think, generally speaking, the general community would take him as the one in their draft. And the only thing I would say is, if you're someone who has the one, don't try to get too pretty with it. I don't think, don't try to be too fancy or try to be offbeat. Just go with McCaffrey. Yes, I don't think he's going to repeat 2,400 yards and 19 touchdowns that he had last year. But a healthy McCaffrey should be able to produce 2,000 total yards and 15 touchdowns. I think that's a pretty safe projection. You look at what Joe Brady's done with his running backs in the last few years. Last year he had Clyde Edwards-Helaire. Clyde Edwards-Helaire had 1,867 total yards and 17 touchdowns in a college season, so less games. And the year before, Alvin Kamara, while splitting time with Ingram, still had roughly 1,600 yards and 18 touchdowns, while Ingram himself also had almost 1,000 yards of all-purpose. So McCaffrey will be fine. His floor is very safe. His floor is probably still like RB3. There's not many guys who can beat him unless something were to happen with an injury, but we just can't predict injuries. And so draft McCaffrey as the one. Mike Davis, grab him as the handcuff in the last round. They cut Bonifon, so just know that Mike Davis is the handcuff for McCaffrey in 2020. At the wide receiver position, DJ Moore is a guy I'm a big fan of for 2020, and I think a lot of people are a big fan of him as well, both in the Dynasty community and in the redraft community. However, I am actually a bit higher on DJ Moore than other people seem to be for redraft. And so here's why. DJ Moore, he's generally a shallower target. You look at where his targets came from, he actually runs a very similar tree to Michael Thomas. He runs a lot of that slant play, a lot of similar routes to what Michael Thomas runs, and he's stepping into his third year after showing a lot of development last season. I think what people don't remember about last season is that he really didn't have a lot of production going into that year. It was his second year, and in his first year, he wasn't really a very productive rookie. And so last season, he all of a sudden spikes up to 135 targets across 15 games, which really wasn't 15 games because he got injured at the very start of one and missed the rest of the season after that. But you look at kind of what he did last year. He had those first 6 games. Then they had the bye week. In those first 6 games, he was solid. Nothing great, but at this point, remember, he's still just developing. He didn't really have a ton of production going into the season, right? And then he hits the bye week, and from the bye week on till he got hurt, he was the wide receiver 2 in fantasy football. That's in half PPR. So from week 8 to 14 or 15 when he got hurt, he was the wide receiver 2, only second to Michael Thomas. And now Joe Brady comes over from a system where Michael Thomas has been dominant. DJ Moore projects to be that same type of player. Teddy Bridgewater was able to support Michael Thomas as a beast of a receiver last year. I think it's a perfect storm right here for DJ Moore. Robbie Anderson and Curtis Samuel, they're outside type of receivers, and even Samuel, who I think can get some in like underneath work. Apparently, he's been really struggling in camp, and the coaching staff wants him he needs to develop more before they're going to utilize him a ton, I think. And so DJ Moore is the guy. He is the Michael Thomas of this offense. That's what Joe Brady's going to see from him. That's how I think he's going to utilize him. And so for me, DJ Moore is the wide receiver 7 or wide receiver 8. Wide receiver 8 for fantasy football in 2020. I'm a big fan, and you can get him as the wide receiver 14 right now as his ADP in half PPR, which just blows my mind. Robbie Anderson and Curtis Samuel, they're guys who I'm willing to take a shot on. Robbie Anderson at the end of the draft, I probably would leave Samuel on the wire personally, but I wouldn't blame you for taking a shot on him. He has an interesting skill set, and in a potentially versatile offense with Joe Brady, he could see some running work and some receiving work, which makes him interesting. And then at the tight end position, Ian Thomas is an interesting prospect because Greg Olsen has seen production in the Carolina offense before. However, we can't treat it the same way because it's a completely new coaching staff. It's a new quarterback. It's going to be a completely new system. And so for more of a comparison, we want to look at like the Saints offense or the LSU offense. The LSU offense last season really didn't have a ton of production from their tight ends. Most of the production came from the running backs out of the backfield catching the ball, as well as the wide receivers with Jamar Chase and Justin Jefferson. On this team, I think that's going to be, DJ Moore, Christian McCaffrey. I think each of them are going to have easily over 100 targets. And then after that, other pieces like Anderson and Samuel will get theirs. And so it's going to be tough. Ian Thomas is probably going to be the 5th in line for targets, potentially the 4th if he can beat out Curtis Samuel. But it's going to be hard for him to have a major role in the offense besides touchdowns. So he's a guy for me that I'm leaving on the wire in a redraft league. But that's just where I stand. He is a guy you can take a shot on and hope he takes that step forward. But I don't think you can just say Greg Olsen was good, therefore he will be good, because it's going to be a completely new system, even though it's the same Carolina Panthers. So that's how I feel about it. In Dynasty, DJ Moore has now become my wide receiver 6 for Dynasty wide receivers. I think there is a set top 5 right now in a lot of people's minds. That top 5 is Michael Thomas, Devontae Adams, Tyreek Hill, Chris Godwin, and DeAndre Hopkins. Those are kind of the big 5 in Dynasty fantasy football right now. And then trying to figure out who that 6 is. A lot of people differ on it. For me, it's DJ Moore. He's just 23 years old as well, so keep that in mind. He was the wide receiver 2 for half of the year last year, and he did that as a 22-year-old. That's crazy. McCaffrey, he's the Dynasty 101. Just don't draft anyone else at the number 1 pick. Make sure you're drafting McCaffrey. If you take anything from this video, if you have the one, make sure you draft McCaffrey. I just think that's a mistake not to. And he's got 3 years on his deal with potentially 6 years. So just anyway, yeah. And then the other one is Ian Thomas. I'm willing to take a shot on him in Dynasty to see how he can develop. I just wanted to mention that because I don't want you to think I'm off of Thomas. I just don't think he's going to be great for this season. I am willing to try him out or take a shot on him because you can probably get him very cheap in a Dynasty league right now. So that is the Panthers. On to my favorite team in the NFL, the New Orleans Saints. And I will try to not be a homer. I will try to not get too excited, but I am a fan of them for fantasy football this year. There are a good chunk of guys here I'm drafting, but I've done my best to put my fair, neutral goggles on when analyzing the team, and this is kind of how it played out. So at quarterback, you've got Drew Brees. Also, I mean, I could talk about the rushing and passing attempts, but it's really not going to change all that much. This offense has been running very similarly for a long time in terms of the amount of rushing and passing attempts that they have per year. It's a fairly balanced offense that wants to utilize both rushing and passing. It's also why Carolina, the Panthers, I had them set it out that way as well. But the quarterback, I'll leave it like this. It's Drew Brees, if you didn't know that. For 10 years, he has been a fantasy quarterback 1 up until last year. Last year, his streak of finishing the year as a quarterback 1 ended at 10 full seasons. However, that was because of injury. When you look at his fantasy points per game, he was the quarterback 8. So you could say in fantasy points per game, he's now on an 11-season run as a quarterback 1 in fantasy football. And I don't think that's stopping this year. The weapons are only getting better this year. They bring in Emmanuel Sanders for him. Traquan Smith is supposedly taking a step forward in training camp. Jared Cook's still there. There was obviously some connection with him and Brees last year. Kamara is hopefully healthy. who's a very, very good receiver out of the backfield. Latavius Murray is still there. Taysom Hill is still there. And so I think the weapons are still very solid for Drew Brees. And I think you're going to see a very similar level of production to what he's been giving you over these last few seasons. I don't think he's slowing down. And for me, he is the quarterback 7 in fantasy football, which is his ADP as well. He's ADP quarterback 7. And so I think he's just worth his draft price. I don't think he's an elite value by any means, but I think where he's going off the board is a fair spot to draft Drew Brees in 2020. At the running back position, Alvin Kamara. What to expect with Alvin Kamara? I'm actually a little bit nervous about Alvin Kamara. I think some people are very confident about him. Some people are very nervous. I'm a little nervous. I don't think he will hold out. I think with the fines that they have implemented, I don't expect anyone to really hold out a ton. The only loophole I've seen is holding out in buildings. So like going to practices and going to training camp, but not actually participating in those things as a player, doing it more as like just helping develop other players. So I guess in a game, what that would look like would be Alvin Kamara going to the game, being on the sideline, talking to all the guys, being a part of the team, helping coach up other players on the team without playing. But I just don't see that happening. I think it sounds like to me, reports are that they're not that far on a contract extension. Alvin Kamara has already been practicing despite not having the contract. The only thing really holding him up at this point is that he had a slight back injury. Another, I guess, red flags. That's 2 red flags already, potential contract and potential contract stuff, as well as the back injury. So those are the 2 things I'm nervous about. I'm not overly nervous about the contract. I'm a little bit nervous with the back injury because you never want your guy to start the year nicked out or nicked up. They will become nicked up. All of them will at some point throughout the year. The question is just how big of an injury is it going to be and can they play through it? But for now, those things are making me a little bit hesitant on Alvin Kamara. However, despite all that stuff, his TD regression is coming. It's a positive regression for him. Last year, he only had 6 touchdowns. He had 18 the season before. So those are coming for him. He's going to get more touchdowns this year. I have him projected for 13. I think that's pretty safe. I know it's not directly the middle. The middle would be 12. So even if you said it was 12, still going to give you very solid production in fantasy football this year. He's going to get his share of rushing. He's going to get 81 receptions like he has done for the past 3 seasons. I think at this point, if you don't project him for 81 receptions, you're just a liar. He was still a top 10 back last year without, like, per game, without the touchdowns. You know, his points per game still had him in the top 10, and he only scored 6 touchdowns. So his yardage is still there. You add those touchdowns this year, he's going to be very solid for fantasy football. They return pretty much the full unit on the offense, and so there's nothing new to learn this year. So even if you did miss a little bit of training camp, there's nothing new. The same offensive line, the same quarterback, the same unit altogether. And so overall, he is my number 4 running back, but he's also my number 4 overall player. I know he's currently being drafted as the 7th ADP overall player. I would be taking him right after I would take Saquon. Well, McCaffrey 1, Saquon 2, Zeke 3. I would take Kamara. I know there's some debate around Kamara, Derrick Henry, Clyde Edwards-Helaire, Dalvin Cook in that range, but everyone has their question marks, and I feel the most comfortable with Alvin Kamara's question marks rather than Dalvin, who doesn't sound like he's going to get a contract at all. Derrick Henry, who we don't know if he's really going to get any passing work, and Clyde Edwards-Helaire, who, well, simply he's just a rookie, so how much utilization is he really going to get? If you draft Kamara, the one thing I do want to say, though, make sure you get Latavius Murray. He is a must handcuff. You look at last season, 2 games Kamara missed. In those 2 games, Latavius Murray scored 60 half-point PPR fantasy points. 60. That's an average of 30 a game. That would be very nice. If you lose Kamara and you can plug him in with a guy who can get you 15 fantasy points per game, that's really solid. And that's what Latavius Murray will do. And so make sure you handcuff with Latavius Murray. At the wide receiver position, Michael Thomas, he set records last year. I'm a huge Michael Thomas fan in real life. I think he's a beast of a player. This year, unfortunately, there's just no way to project him to repeat that. When a player breaks records, does things that are so elite, you've seen their peak. Like it's less than 1% chance he breaks his own record the following year. And so right now in Dynasty, at least over the summer, I personally have had to sell him. Anywhere I've had him, I've sold him because his value is at its peak. Um, like I said with McCaffrey, like I'm more comfortable saying McCaffrey would repeat as the RB1 just because the talent there. It just makes so much sense that he actually would repeat there. And I don't normally feel comfortable saying a guy will repeat because it actually doesn't happen very often. But with McCaffrey, I'm pretty confident about it. With Michael Thomas, I'm not so confident about it that he'll repeat as the wide receiver 1. And so I just wanted to throw that out there because he's not going to repeat exactly what he did. He's still going to get tons of targets. But they bring in Sanders. Sanders has been a 90 target plus guy over the past like 6 seasons, 7 seasons. Since 2013, he's been at over 90 targets every season. The coaches in camp have been talking up Tre'Quan Smith. I haven't statted him out because that to me is coach speak, but I haven't statted him out for tons of targets. But there is a world where Tre'Quan Smith does get up to the 40 range in targets, and that would eat into Michael Thomas's production. And so I wouldn't say it's a lock. He's the number 1 guy. In Dynasty, people are treating him like the number 1 guy, obviously. So I've been trading him there. If you have him, I would shop him a little bit, just see what you can get for him. That is how I feel about him. But with all that said, in redraft, I think you have to still draft him as the wide receiver 1 because if I had to pick someone who had the highest % chance at being the number 1 wide receiver, I would say it's Michael Thomas, but I'd say it's only like a 30% chance he gets there and ends up as the wide receiver 1 just because predicting the number 1 wide receiver year over year, it's just hard to do. And so we'll have to see what happens, but I would still be drafting him there. However, I'm only drafting him 7th overall. The other running backs I mentioned, I'm drafting all 6 of them before him except for Clyde Edwards-Helaire. Clyde Edwards-Helaire is my 8th. So that's the only running back I've mentioned who I would take after Michael Thomas, but that's how I feel about it all. And so in your drafts, take Thomas at 7 if all the other guys are gone. But otherwise, I think it's really important to make sure you're getting a running back in those early rounds. And so that's also partially why I'm a little bit down on Thomas in his overall ranking and have him 1 behind his ADP of 6th overall. Sanders, I mentioned him. He will get targets. He is new to the team, but he will get his 90 targets probably. And he will be a guy who I don't think you're going to want to use him a ton, but he'll have flex appeal in some weeks. He's a good bench stash at his price. And so I'm willing to draft him later in your drafts to help fill your bench with a veteran who can be very solid for you. Last person to talk about here, Jared Cook. Jared Cook was, I think right now, like it's hard in the community because you get on these players last year who helped you a ton in fantasy football. And one of those guys was Jared Cook. He was absolutely buzzing in the second half of the season last year as a tight end. However, I will warn you, a lot of that was because of touchdowns. He scored 9 touchdowns last year. Before last year, he'd never scored more than 6 touchdowns in a season. And keep in mind, this guy is 36 years old. He's played a lot of NFL seasons, and he's never scored more than 6. And so last year, he gets 9. He was awesome in fantasy football, but don't buy into it too much. I think he's overpriced this year because people are remembering how good he was last season. But his targets were not great. His yards were not great. It was really his touchdowns, and I think his touchdowns will come down a bit. We were talking about that positive regression for Alvin, and I think those touchdowns are going to come from Jared Cook losing some of them because they have to be lost somewhere for Alvin Kamara to gain them. And so I think Jared Cook is one of those guys who's going to see less touchdowns than he had last year. And as a result, he's my tight end 11, whereas ADP, he's tight end 9. And talking about another guy we talked on this show about is Hayden Hurst. Hayden Hurst is going 33 picks after him in drafts. So roughly 2 to 3 rounds later, I would much rather have Hurst this year. So you can wait a couple extra rounds and get Hurst. That's what I'd be doing in your drafts. For Dynasty, keep an eye on the Kamara extension. Kamara, I think, will be great on any team. He's so efficient, but the Saints are a really, really good running team. And so any other situation is a slight downgrade other than maybe like, I don't even know, honestly. I can't say a team off the top of my head where I would say Alvin Kamara would be better than being in the Saints. It's really hard to find a spot for him where he would be utilized better. So keep that in mind. This is an old team, so you're going to kind of have to treat it year by year, see what happens. The year Drew Brees goes, it's going to be different. The Saints have been, I mean, you look at the Patriots with Tom Brady gone, people don't want anything to do with the Patriots this year, and they still have Cam Newton, who's a good quarterback there. And so keep that in mind. We're taking this a year at a time, and we'll see what happens. And the one other player I want to mention for Dynasty is Adam Troutman. They drafted him as a tight end uh, out of Dayton, so a lot of unknown there, but I actually like the talent a lot. Apparently, he had a very strong camp. He's behind Jared Cook, who I mentioned already is 36. I think he is the future at the tight end position on this team, and so he's worth a stash. Toss him on your taxi squad in dynasty leagues. All right, the last team we are talking about today, Tampa Bay, the Buccaneers. They are a tough team to figure out this year because you have Tom Brady, 43-year-old, for the first time in a new place, with a new coach, with new weapons. However, when you look at what Tom Brady has had as weapons over the last 2 years, this unit is by far the best in terms of his weapons. The coaching staff with Bruce Arians has continually produced very good quarterbacks in fantasy football. I think as a blend, you get two great football minds in Brady and Arians, and they're going to be able to find ways to be successful on the field. And so as a result, I've actually warmed up to Tom Brady as a low-end quarterback one for fantasy football this year. He, like I said, best weapons. They're going to have a lot of volume. Bruce Arians' offenses like to throw the ball, so I have them predicted for another 600 passing attempts. Tom Brady has been able to handle over 570 attempts over the last 3 seasons, and he hasn't looked like he's slowing down. Heck, he had 613 attempts last season. I think this year he's going to have a lot of attempts, and so that compared to I think he has talent. You have Mike Evans there, Chris Godwin there. His Rob Gronkowski's there with him now. I think you will see him still produce numbers, and he's going to be my quarterback 10 in my rankings, despite being the ADP quarterback 12. And so I think at his price, I think he's a pretty decent pickup. He's a guy who I actually now have in 2 leagues out of my 9 as my quarterback, both redraft leagues, but just something to keep in mind. I'm actually confident enough in saying I think I'm willing to trust Brady as my main guy and stack another guy on top of him who I can start if there's maybe a better matchup for that guy in week to week. But a guy who I'm willing to take in redraft this year is Tom Brady. All right. That one kind of hurts. As a Saints fan, it's tough to cheer for or have Tom Brady, who's playing for the Buccaneers. But anyway, at the running back position, we have Ronald Jones, Leonard Fournette, LaShawn McCoy, and Keyshawn Vaughn. If you didn't hear the news, Daria Gunbowale got cut. And so what does that mean in this offense? I think right now we have to throw ADPs out the window. I will mention them right here. My rankings for these players: Ronald Jones, RB34, ADP, RB30. Leonard Fournette is my RB39. He's ADP, RB19. My ranking for LaShawn McCoy is RB59. His ADP is RB60. Now let's toss those out the window because the ADPs, my rankings, we don't have to toss out the window, but the ADP has not adjusted yet. And so it's going to be hard to know where in your draft these guys are going to fall because, well, it's fresh. The Leonard Fournette signing was just this past week. It's going to take a while. I don't think the drafts are ever going to adjust in time because there's been so many drafts before this Fournette news. And so we just have to try to figure this one out. And the way I see it happening is you look at last season, Ronald Jones and Peyton Barber. Bruce Arians called Ronald Jones the starter, but then Peyton Barber, there were games where Ronald Jones would just get his ass stapled to the bench, and Peyton Barber would end up taking a large share of the carries and getting fantasy points, and they kind of rotated starts. And I think at the start of the season, now they've said Rojo is still our guy, but Leonard Fournette is a talented player. I don't love Leonard Fournette as a talent, but I think he's better than Peyton Barber. Let's put it that way. And so I think he's going to get some run. He's going to take over the Peyton Barber role and be pretty effective in that role. And so we're just going to see 2 guys who, on a week-to-week basis, it's going to be hard to really know who's going to be the guy. I'm going to say at the start of the season, it will be Ronald Jones who gets the opportunity because he's been in the system for longer, and Bruce Arians' systems are pretty tricky to learn. At least that's been the reports from players. They're a little bit tough to learn, especially now you've got Tom Brady who he's going to want the guys he knows on the field. He's spent the whole offseason with Rojo. He has just started working with Leonard Fournette. And so We will see what happens with this backfield. That's how I feel about it. I think also LaShawn McCoy, he's going to get receiving work. McCoy will, because Dare's gone. So McCoy now steps in to become the primary pass catching back. Keyshawn Vaughn will be still kicked to the return team work. Funny enough, David Johnson had the same role. I'm not saying I believe in Keyshawn Vaughn a ton. I'm actually very low on him as a rookie in Dynasty, but keep that in mind. We can't just say he has no value yet because, well, David Johnson, all he was in his first year was the return man. He was a third-round pick for the Arizona Cardinals. Bruce Arians brought in veterans for that first year. They had Chris Johnson. They had Andre Ellington. And then the next season, it was the David Johnson show. So keep that in mind with Keyshawn Vaughn in Dynasty. But for the running backs for redraft, I'm drafting Rojo first. I'm drafting Fournette second. I'm willing to draft McCoy in the very last round. You'll want to see how this plays out. It's going to be a week-to-week kind of thing. But sometimes this is where you find value. And it feels icky because you don't like these crowded backfields. But if someone can emerge and you got them late in the draft, they can have value. So for me, I'm going to be taking my shot potentially on Ronald Jones, but likely it'll be maybe even McCoy at the very end to get the receiving work. But this one's really tough for me to give you advice on because to me, personally, I have no shares of these guys yet. I have a couple more drafts coming up, and I'm willing to take Ronald Jones or LaShawn McCoy. I'm staying away from Fournette because I think a lot of people, someone's going to take him thinking he's the starter, and I don't think he's the starter. But this is how I feel about it. I would be drafting Rojo if I were you, but as a whole, really tough backfield, and you're going to have to be playing this one by year. If you own either of them, try to watch the game. Try to see what utilization they get. Try to see who picks up their pass blocking assignments because whoever picks up the pass blocking will be the one that Tom Brady wants on the field. Keep an eye on those things, the little things that they're doing well, because that will help you project who's going to get to stay on the field in the coming weeks. At the receiver position, there are two studs in this offense, Chris Godwin and Mike Evans. And so I think a lot of people are saying, well, Tom Brady's there. Jameis Winston was willing to just try anything. And so the value on Godwin and Evans has come down a bit. And I agree with that. Jameis Winston to Tom Brady. Tom Brady's not going to take as many chances as Jameis Winston did. And as a result, I don't think these guys are going to get as high of a yards per reception as they did last year. However, last year, on a points per game basis, they were the wide receiver 2 and 3 behind Michael Thomas across the entire season. The only problem for these guys is they got hurt. And so at the end of the season, people see Mike Evans, he was the wide receiver 12. But he really wasn't. He was the wide receiver 3. He just missed the last 3 games of the season because he was hurt. And so I think some people who are really out on these guys, maybe they are missing on that fact. Like Evans, he's going to take a step back, but he was the wide receiver 3. So a step back still probably keeps him right around the fringe wide receiver 1-2 range for me. And Chris Godwin, this offense was designed around Chris Godwin. You look at what Bruce Arians did in Arizona. Larry Fitzgerald was extremely talented, and the offense really ran through him. Chris Godwin is that same role in this offense. Bruce Arians basically said it when he came in last year. He said Godwin's going to be on the field for 95% of snaps. He's going to see tons of targets in this offense. I think he said he's going to get like 100 catch guy. And you look at if you statted him out for a full 16, I believe he would have got right at just above the 100 mark in catches. And so this offense runs through Godwin. I think this year with Tom Brady's skill set, you're going to see Chris Godwin still be very, very good with Mike Evans still having an opportunity to be a fringe wide receiver 1-2 who's going to have some immense weeks as a whole. I don't think anyone else is really going to get on the field a ton other than Scotty Miller. But still, Scotty Miller, I don't know how much work he's going to get because I know they're going to want to try to get a few tight ends out there, especially towards the red zone. Scott Miller, maybe he'll be on the field and get some targets throughout the game, but he won't be on the field come in the red zone. It's going to be 2 tight end sets, I think, in the red zone. And so I think what you're going to see is Godwin. I have him as my wide receiver 5 on the year, which is above ADP, which is 6. I have Mike Evans at the wide receiver 13, but he's basically right in there with basically wide receiver 8 through 14 are all within 2 fantasy points for me. So a back end wide receiver 1 for Mike Evans and his ADP's wide receiver 8. So I think they're worth their draft prices at the moment if you believe in them. And then in the end zone, it's going to be those two and OJ Howard and Rob Gronkowski, not Scotty Miller. So I'm leaving Scotty Miller on the wire despite some camp hype and despite the whole white slot receiver that Tom Brady likes. That's not what he likes. He just likes a guy who can play the slot, and Chris Godwin is that guy to me. So I don't see too much like of the hype on Scotty Miller. Why people are buying Scotty Miller a ton. And then you look at the tight end position, Rob Gronkowski and OJ Howard. Gronk at his ADP is just too high because Cam Brate is still on the team. All three of them are going to see some work on the field. I think OJ Howard's actually going to run over Rob Gronkowski. Gronkowski is actually going to be the tight end 2 on this team, potentially even the 3 I've heard, because just his size and athleticism, like he's still going to be the guy that Tom Brady wants to look to in the red zone, but he's not necessarily going to be able to be on the field all the time. And so right now, I believe he's going as the tight end 10 in redraft leagues. He's outside of the top 20 for me at tight end. I'm not drafting Gronk or OJ Howard this year. I advise you to just steer clear for now. Leave them on the wire. If one of them gets injured, the other one gains more value, but I'm willing to miss on them and draft a guy like Blake Jarwin, who you can get at the very last pick of your draft and get much better production across the entire season, in my opinion. Not too much to say in terms of Dynasty, but this is what I would say in Dynasty. Just like the New Orleans Saints, it's a 1 year at a time type of team, and this team is going to run through one player and one player only, and that is Chris Godwin. Like I said, with Larry Fitzgerald, Bruce Arians' system runs through that all-purpose guy who you want to get the ball in his hands, out of the slot, on the outside, and let him do work once he gets the ball. That's Chris Godwin on this team. They don't have an elite running back. Their quarterback's 43, potentially will only play 1 year. They don't have an amazing tight end like George Kittle or Travis Kelce. This offense will run through Chris Godwin. Mike Evans will be a great secondary piece and will continue to be a fringe wide receiver 1-2 for a while now, or for a long time still, is what I meant to say. But Godwin is the engine that runs this offense. And so for me, big fan of Godwin in the Dynasty leagues. Otherwise, Scotty Miller, yes, I'm willing to stash him, see what happens with him, or Tyler Johnson, the rookie they drafted this year. But Godwin is the guy to own on this team in Dynasty. So that is it for this episode. These are my rankings overall. These are actually my projections. My rankings are slightly different. I'll be dropping my rankings on Twitter. Pretty much, I use the projections to create tiers, and then within the tiers, I bump guys up or down depending on who I actually would draft based on the risk and the situation. And I have them projected for stuff, but that also doesn't really take into fact the range of outcomes that they have for them. So some guys towards the end of these rankings as well, higher up if they have better upside, and lower down if they're a floor play. And so just keep that in mind. I'll be posting those on Twitter. You can check me out on Twitter at Sawyer_FF. That's where you'll be able to see my rankings. They should be going live today. And thank you again for stopping in and checking out the video. I appreciate it a ton. And if you have any questions, it's draft season, reach out to me. I love interacting with the community. I would love to answer your questions and help you kill your drafts. So that is all. Thank you again so much. And we will talk later this week with the last of the divisional breakdowns.